very much. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, guys, let's get straight to it then. So, hands up, questions. Let's go. Freddie, over to you.
So quite a simple one. What do you think is the single strongest criticism of biblical inerrancy?
The strongest single argument against biblical inerrancy. I used to hold the biblical inerrancy for many years, starting when I was, I guess, right before college, when I was 15, and for many years after that. I think the biggest argument against it is the fact that there are contradictions in the Bible, that there are sometimes reports of the same event that cannot be reconciled with each other. And that shows that if you've got two contradictory accounts, that one of them, either one or both of them is wrong. And so I can provide lots of examples if you want to know them, but that's the strongest argument.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. On to the next question. Charlie, do you want to go with yours?
Yeah.
Put your hands up, guys. Questions, please.
So, Professor Ehrman, in your book, God's Problem, you say that the problem of suffering is the reason why you ultimately lost your faith. We've been studying this in class recently, and I'm interested to hear what is your view on the Christian argument that without suffering, joy and happiness cannot truly exist?
It's a very interesting argument. And on one level, I actually agree with that argument. I think that if we all were like there was no pain in life, then we wouldn't appreciate the good things. And I think all of us have experienced that. I mean, when something bad happened to you, then something good happens, you feel even better because you know what it was like to feel bad. So I get that and I understand it. The issue with suffering for me is not that kind of thing so much, though. I think we could have a life where there are bad things that happen, like what have happened to me. For example, I live a fantastic life. I'm very, very lucky to have the fantastic life I've had, but I've had suffering. I mean, I've had loved ones die. I've been divorced. I've been poor in my life without much money. I mean, I've had trouble finding employment. I mean, I've had these hard things. If that was the extent of the hardship that people experience in this world, then I'd be quite happy to say, look, you've got to have some ups and downs, and without the downs, you're not going to experience the ups, and so that would be fine. The kind of suffering that has caused a problem for me is not that kind of suffering. The kind of suffering that has led me to leave the faith altogether is what you might call suffering in extremis, really serious, hardcore suffering. Just about every 10 seconds in the world, there's a child who dies of starvation. It is not, there is no redeeming side of somebody starving to death. There's no redeeming side for them. There's no redeeming side for their parents, for the people they know, for their friends. There's no redemption in it, in my opinion. And there are millions of people who are starving to death. And there are people dying, in England, you've got the same problem we have. You have lots of thousands of people on ventilators right now. There's very, very serious suffering in the world. There was a tsunami that hit before you all were born that killed 300,000 people. It's just like a wave killed them. It's like they weren't doing anything and they didn't get anything out of it. So my view is that my understanding of Christianity was that there's a God who created the world. This was my view as a believer. The God who created the world, and that he loves people, and he wants the best for people, and that if you pray, he'll answer your prayers. He intervened in history to bring about salvation, and so he's a God who's active in the world and making things so we can do well and survive and have salvation. And I got to a point where I just didn't believe it anymore. I just didn't think so, because if he is active, if he answers my prayers, for example, suppose I pray that I'll get into a particular university, and I do get into that university, so I want to go to Oxford. Okay, oh my God, I got into Oxford. God's answered my prayer. Well, that's great. I mean, it's great that God answered my prayer. But when he answered my prayer to get into Oxford, why didn't he answer the prayer of these millions of children who are starving to death? it would be been no harder for him to do that if he existed. And so I don't think the fact that we have ups and downs is an explanation for why there's this massive kind of suffering. It could be an explanation for why I stubbed my toe the other day. Does that make sense, Charlie?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, hands up, Sam, over to you.
I was just wondering, without the problem of evil, are the discrepancies found in the Bible enough to make you not believe?
No. So the discrepancies in the Bible were important for me personally because I had been a very conservative evangelical Christian, and I believed the Bible had no errors of any kind. And when I started finding discrepancies, I just realized that was wrong. And once you have kind of an opening, you start seeing discrepancies, you start realizing actually there are a lot of these, even if you don't want to see them, they start cropping up. That showed me that the Bible is not inerrant. But that, for me, that had no bearing on whether there was a God or not. It's only in modern times, it's only since the end of the 19th century that any Christians started saying that belief in the Bible as without mistake is necessary for faith. Throughout Christian history, that has not been the idea at all. And so when I left my committed evangelical faith, I remained a Christian for many years because I just thought that, okay, well, the Bible is a human book. God used humans to write the Bible, so it's human. It has human mistakes. That's fine. I still believed that Christ somehow was a way of salvation, that so what ended up getting me weren't the contradictions at all. Virtually all of my friends who are Christian, most of my friends are still church-going Christians, and most of them simply don't think the Bible's inerrant. They know there are contradictions in the Bible because they think it's a human book, even though they think it's an important book that reveals God in some ways. But it's the problem of suffering that did it to me, not the problems of the Bible.
Go, Scarlett.
How do you explain the multiple independent sources which provide evidence to like the crucifixion of the biblical events?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. I don't know how to improve the sound.
Do you want to maybe come down, Scarlett, just for the speaker? Just come down to maybe about my level in the bottom.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, how do you explain the multiple independent sources which provide evidence for the crucifixion and other biblical events, which for another historical event would be sufficient proof?
Let me see if I understood, because I'm still having trouble. You said, what do I make of other sources that show the historicity of the crucifixion?
Yeah.
Just the crucifixion?
And other biblical events.
And other
biblical events.
Yeah, other biblical events. So there are, I would say that most of the information in the Bible about what happened in the past, whether in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, most of the information that's given in the Bible is found only in the Bible. Most of it is not verified by external sources. You may know from your studies that even Jesus, who I think Jesus is the most important historical figure ever to have lived in the world ever, period. I mean, there are over 2 billion people who worship Jesus. I mean, who else can you say that about? You might want to say someone else is as important as Jesus, I don't know, Hitler or somebody is as important. No, there's nothing even close to Jesus. So, but Jesus is never mentioned in other sources for 80 years after his death. In other words, when Jesus died sometime around the year 30, we don't have a reference to him, and by this I mean pagan, by Greek or Roman sources, until about 80 years later. He is mentioned by Josephus in the 90s, who's a Jewish historian. But for the entire first century, Jesus is never mentioned by a Greek or Roman source, apart from Josephus, this Jewish author. Well, that's weird, but it's the way it is. You do start getting references to Jesus, and these references to Jesus in the early 2nd century and in Josephus do mention him being crucified. And I think the crucifixion is absolutely something that happened. Jesus certainly was crucified. There are other things in the Bible that are verified by outside sources, but not a lot. I mean, just the Gospels, for example. Even Pontius Pilate We don't hear much about Pontius Pilate at all in any sources until Josephus again. And so part of that is because we just don't have very many records from that period. And just most records that we have aren't as interested in Christianity. So I don't take that as a problem per se, but I think that the historical record is rather sparse when it comes to Christianity outside of the Christian sources. I don't know if that's answering the question well or not. Is it?
You mean the independent sources from the gospel? Scarlett was sort of implying why are there independent gospel sources?
Yeah. Well, that's a yeah. Well, that's obviously a closely related and important question. So my view is, I think, still a pretty standard view that Mark is our first gospel. That Matthew and Luke both used Mark, but they also had other sources. For example, Matthew and Luke have a bunch of sayings not found in Mark. The Lord's Prayer, for example, or the Beatitudes. They're in some of the parables. They're in Matthew and Luke, but they're not in Mark. And so since they didn't get them from Mark, they probably got them from somewhere else. And so scholars have this other source. I don't know if you'll talk about the Q source, but there's this other source that scholars talk about. And Matthew has some of his own stories he got from some source or another. Luke has his own stories he got from some source or another. John has a whole bunch of other stories. And so then you get later gospels that seem to be independent. So you get a lot of these things, and that's really helpful because any historian who wants to show that something happened in the past loves having multiple sources, especially if you've got sources that did not collaborate with each other. Like if somebody didn't copy somebody else and they're independent sources and they both say similar things, well, that's good for a historian. So that's a very helpful thing. And so historians who are trying to figure out what happened in Jesus' life do indeed look at these various sources to see if they're independent or not. Is that answering the question?
Yeah.
Cool. Eliana.
You use suffering to explain the non-existence of God, but what would you say to the billions of Christians who believe in God on the basis of what they believe are truly divine experiences, for example, or a plethora of other reasons like the design argument?
Yeah. No, I think most people who believe in God do believe in God because of personal experiences they've had, and mainly I would say the main reason people believe in the Christian God is because they were born and raised Christian. And that's the first thing. That's the most important thing. And the evidence for that is pretty obvious. The vast majority of Christians in the world live in Christian countries and are surrounded by Christians. So when somebody's born in Mongolia, they tend not to be Christian unless somebody converts them. So most people are Christian because that's how they're raised, and it just makes common sense. Just like most people who are Marxist are raised Marxist because it makes common sense to them. And Buddhists, it's just political or religious views you're raised with. That's what you end up believing, unless something changes your mind. Most people are not willing to have their minds changed. But many Christians who have been raised Christian have also had personal experiences that confirm to them their beliefs, just as Buddhists do, and Hindus do, and Muslims do, and Jews do. All these religions have people in them who are confirmed in their views because of their personal experiences. They feel some kind of presence of God in their life. They experience something that they can't attribute to anything except for God. Something happens to them, and they trust God, that this is a sign that their belief is right. And so I absolutely, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's why I was a Christian. I was raised a Christian, and then I had experiences that confirmed my Christianity. I don't think that personal experiences of other people, though, prove that Christianity is right or prove that God exists. Just as I don't think that the personal experience of Muslims shows that they show that Allah, that their God, Allah, exists, or that personal experiences of Hindus shows that there are many gods exist, or that the experiences of ancient Greeks proved that Zeus really exists. I don't think that's proof, but I think it is the reason that people usually have some kind of belief in God. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, Laura.
You said that Jesus was the most important man who ever lived. Do you think that's in relation to the whole world or just the Western world?
I think it's the whole world. I mean, there's nobody in the East who's worshipped by 2 billion people. No actual human historical figure. And so, and partly I say that because of that. But partly I say it because the West has become so dominant in world affairs, so that you know, the West, the influence of the West on the East is fairly unidirectional. I mean, it's like, you know, when you go to, you know, you go to Tokyo, you can find your McDonald's there, right? And so, like, the West is really, and the West, the entire West, not just the religion, but the culture and the civilization of the West has been so determined by Christianity. There's been nothing like Christianity to influence the West. Even things like, you know, you might argue that like Greek philosophy maybe influenced the West as much, or maybe Roman empirical order, or things like that. And those are highly influential. There are a lot of things that are highly influential, but in my judgment, there's been nothing as influential as the church, and the reason is because of the way the history of the West worked. Once the Roman Empire was taken over by Christianity in the 4th century, the Christians basically took over the culture, not just the religion, but the entire culture of the West. And so the entire social life, politics, economics are all determined by Christian views of things. I'm not saying they're the correct Christian views, but Christians were, and so art, literature, music, philosophy, throughout from the 4th century up until modern times has been dominantly influenced by Christianity, and this kind of culture now is you know, has headed east. And so that's why I think, you know, Jesus is at the heart of it, and I think that's why I would say Jesus is the most important historical figure. Without Jesus, our entire world would be radically different, and I don't know too many other people you could say that about. You could say that some countries would be very, very different, you know, if it weren't for Charlemagne, or if it weren't for Julius Caesar, or whatever. But I mean, in terms of, or Hitler, or, you know, Churchill, or whatever. But in terms of the whole world, I mean, Jesus is really, I don't think he's got much of a competitor.
Well, just to say, you know, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. These pupils in here have to write essays showing the relationship between philosophy and Christian theology. Now you mentioned Western philosophy. In your view, how much has Western philosophy influenced Christian doctrine?
Influence Christian doctrine? No, that's a very good question. Okay, yeah, right. You're answering on that. You got a task. That's a good one. You know, it's very interesting how, if you trace the history of Christian theology, because Christianity, of course, started out as a Jewish movement, and the earliest Christians were not philosophers. Jesus was not a philosopher. He wasn't trained in philosophy. He didn't know the Hellenistic philosophical movements such as Stoicism and Epicureanism and Platonism. They would have been a foreign language to him. Jesus was influenced by Jewish thought at the time, which was only remotely connected with anything going on in Greek philosophical traditions. Eventually, and his earliest followers, of course, were Jews, and they accepted Jewish ways of looking at the world. Eventually, over time, the vast majority of Christian converts came from, not from Jewish circles, but from pagan circles, from non-Christian circles, which were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. And so already in the 2nd Christian century, you start getting some Christian thinkers, such as Justin Martyr, for example, who are heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, or later the church father Origen. By the time you get to the 4th century, when Christianity is formulating its important creeds, for example, the Nicene Creed, when they're deciding things like, who is Christ really? Is he fully God? Is he fully man? Is he both at once? How does it work? They started using Greek philosophical categories, and the terms they use are philosophical terms. And so it becomes, if you go really deeply into this, it becomes very interesting whether it's Platonic or Aristotelian philosophy that becomes more significant for philosophical thought. through the Middle Ages, including people like Aquinas, for example. And so, so I would say that, interestingly, Greek philosophical traditions, as they were mediated through Rome, the Roman philosophers more or less were taking over a lot of things they were getting from the Greeks. As Christianity becomes more and more Greek, which happens in the 2nd century, I would say that the philosophical traditions are far more important to Christian theology than the original Jewish ways of thinking, than even the Old Testament. For professional theologians who are actually thinking about these things, it's these philosophical categories that matter far more than Jewish thought at the time of Jesus.
Thank you.
So despite like Jesus not being found in many other texts outside of the Bible, and the Bible having so many errors, I believe you still, claim that Jesus did exist. What persuades you towards that?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and I think it's a question that nobody was really asking 20 years ago, but it has been asked over the years. The first time somebody really seriously started asking the question was actually at the end of the 18th century. During the French Revolution, there were people who were raising the question, people in France, some thinkers in France. But by and large, this has never been an issue. But it has become an issue again in the last 20 years or so. I think Jesus existed because there's just such good evidence for it. I mean, I'm not a believer in Jesus myself, and so it's not that I need to think he existed so I can have him to believe in. It's just, as a historian, I want to look for what kind of evidence there is for the existence of a person. And for Jesus, I had used the same evidence that I would use to understand, what's the evidence that the Emperor Tiberius lived, or that Charlemagne lived, or that pick your figure, the Cornwall lived, and pick your figure. What do you do if you want to find evidence they lived? You look for sources. And so you want a lot of sources if possible. You want more than one source. You want the sources not to be relying on each other. You want them to be fairly close to the time of the events. You want them to, you want some sources that aren't just trying to pass off their own agendas. And so when it comes to Jesus, I mean, just within the New Testament itself, I mentioned already, you have Mark as a source. You've got a source that scholars call Q, which did not know Mark, is an independent source. You got the source that gave Matthew his stories, which we call M for Matthew's source. You have L, which provided Luke with his sources. You've got Paul. Paul's before any of them. Paul, the Apostle Paul, writes about Jesus' brother. Paul knows his brother. And he knows Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. And so, in addition to that, you have the book of Acts, which is written by the same guy who wrote Luke, but he has traditions about Jesus not found in Luke. And so you just start adding up these sources. And yes, these are all Christian sources. But, every source for Julius Caesar basically is a Roman source. And so it's like, you can't discount it because it happens to be somebody. So the issue is, if Jesus didn't exist, how do you explain all that? That within a few decades, you have these independent things. It's like it would just blow your mind if it doesn't go back to a historical figure. And so my view is that there's no doubt Jesus existed. The doubt is, what did he really say and do? And that's where almost all the debates really are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Bart, do you have enough time for one more question?
I absolutely do, yes.
Cool. Questions? Nat, go for it.
Do you feel that your move away from Christianity was reluctant, at least at first? And if so, why was confronting the reality of the evidence that you've mentioned, the contradictions and the suffering, so difficult for you?
Yeah, no, it was very, very emotionally, it was extremely difficult for me. As I said, I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised Episcopalian, so it's a kind of American version of Anglicanism. And I was active as an altar boy all the way through high school. And then I had a very deep religious experience when I was 15. I had a born-again evangelical experience. I went to a fundamentalist Bible college. I was really, really committed. I tried to convert everybody that I knew. I mean, I was very, very committed. And then even when I was a liberal Christian, Christianity was just part of my life. I mean, going to church, having friends, saying prayers, taking communion. I mean, this is just and my scholarship was on the Bible. I mean, this is my entire life. When I started having doubts, it was very traumatic for me, because it meant giving up what I had always thought was true, and not just true, but really like vital to life and the afterlife. And so it was very, very difficult for me. So I did not go easily, but I all along felt that I really had to accept the truth, whatever the truth was. And when I was still a Christian having my doubts, I started saying to myself, look, even St. Augustine said that all truth comes from God. And so if something's true, you can't be afraid of it. And if you should not believe something that you don't think is true. And so over time, the more and more I thought about it, I wrestled with it, I struggled with it. And so basically I went kicking and screaming, but I finally realized, I just don't believe it anymore. I just don't think it's right. I don't think there's a God in this world who is active, who is answering prayers, who is helping people, because it doesn't look like he is for millions and millions and millions of people. So I did go reluctantly, and I had several fears. I was afraid I would go to hell. And so that took a while to kind of process through my head. I was afraid I would have no moral compass. Like, how am I going to guide my actions? Like, how am I going to know? How will I just become completely unethical and not care about anybody else? I mean, will I become a complete nihilist? Will I become like somebody who doesn't care or who finds no meaning in life? Will I become like just a real creepy person now? I mean, what? And it turns out none of that happened. I am no less moral or immoral than I was before. I am not. I don't despair of life. I'm not afraid of death. In fact, now for me, it doesn't happen for everyone like this, but for me, now that I'm not a believer and I think that this life is all there is, I think when I'm dead, I'm going to be dead. I'm not going to exist anymore. I just think actually it makes me relish life more. It makes me appreciate life more. It makes me appreciate people more. And so I invest more time in my friends, my family, my students, my life, my career, because this is all I got. It's not a dress rehearsal. This is it. And so I'm trying to enjoy it as much as I can. And so for me, I didn't think it would be this way, but it's turned out for me to be an advantage in some ways for my happiness. Not everybody has that experience. That just happens to be mine. But I did go, in answer to your question, yeah, I went very reluctant.